The sun was just climbing over the ridges, painting the prairie gold. For Thomas Hale, a weathered cowboy with more years behind him than ahead, mornings on the ranch were always the same. The creak of the barn door, the low nicker of horses, the smell of dust and leather. But that morning, something was wrong. At the far edge of his land, where the fence posts leaned against the endless horizon, he spotted movement. At first he thought it was a stray calf tangled in the wire, but as he rode closer, his chest tightened. It wasn't an animal, it was a girl. Barely 12. Her wrists were bound to the fence with coarse rope, her face bruised, her lips cracked from thirst. She looked at him with hollow eyes that had already seen too much. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop, heart pounding. He could have turned away. Out here in the Wild West, folks minded their own business. Trouble had a way of spreading like wildfire, and this girl was nothing but trouble waiting to happen. But something in her gaze, a silent plea, a flicker of defiance despite her broken state, struck him deeper than a bullet ever could. He swung down from his saddle, knife in hand. With one swift cut, the rope fell, and in that moment, Thomas Hale's quiet life ended. What began as a rescue would soon drag him into a storm of secrets, vengeance, and a fight for justice that would test every ounce of grit he had left. Thomas Hale carried the girl into his cabin, her body light as a sack of feathers, though every bruise and cut told the story of a weight she had been forced to bear. He laid her gently on the cot by the fire, the only warmth in that lonely shack of timber and stone. For a long while she didn't speak. She just stared at the flames, her eyes wide and hollow, as though afraid they might leap out and burn her too. Thomas poured her a tin cup of water, and when she drank, it was with the desperation of someone who hadn't tasted kindness in weeks. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low, steady, the way a man speaks to a spooked horse. The girl's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only silence. Thomas didn't press her. He knew better than most that silence could be its own kind of shield. Instead, he set a plate of bread and beans before her. She ate slowly at first, then faster, until the plate was clean. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "My pa," she said. The words hit Thomas harder than a rifle butt. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her, trying to make sense of it. A father abandoning his own blood, tying her to a fence like a stray dog. Out here in the West, men were rough, yes, but there was a line, and crossing it meant you weren't a man at all. "What's your name, girl?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Don't got one no more." He said I wasn't his daughter, said I was nothing. Thomas felt something stir inside him. Anger, yes, but also a strange, protective ache he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his own past, of the family he'd lost to fever long ago, and the emptiness that had followed him like a shadow ever since. "Well," he said after a long pause, "if you're under my roof, you're not nothing. You hear me?" The girl looked at him then, really looked at him, as if testing whether his words carried truth. For the first time, a flicker of life sparked in her eyes. But outside, the prairie wind howled against the cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of dust and danger. Thomas knew this wasn't the end of the matter. A man who could abandon his own child wouldn't just disappear, and if he came looking, he'd bring trouble with him. Trouble Thomas Hale thought he'd left behind years ago. The days that followed were uneasy ones. Thomas Hale was a man used to silence, the kind that stretched across the prairie, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the lowing of cattle. But now silence had a different weight. It lived in the girl, heavy and unspoken, filling the cabin like smoke. She rarely spoke, though her eyes followed him everywhere. When he saddled his horse, she watched. When he chopped wood, she watched. When he sat by the fire at night, staring into the flames, she sat across from him, small hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. Thomas tried not to ask too many questions. He knew wounds like hers didn't heal with words. But he also knew the West had a way of sniffing out weakness, and if he didn't understand what kind of trouble she carried, it might swallow them both whole. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he finally spoke. "You said your pa left you tied to that fence. Why?" The girl's jaw tightened. She didn't answer at first. Then in a voice flat and cold, she said, "Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to." Thomas leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped. "What did you see?" Her eyes flickered to the window, as if afraid the prairie itself might be listening. Men, talking with him. They gave him money, told him to keep quiet about something. I don't know what. But when I asked, he hit me, said I'd ruined everything. Next morning, he tied me up and left me there. Thomas felt his stomach knot. Bribery, secrets, men who paid to keep things buried. Out here, that could mean anything. Stolen cattle, land grabs, even murder. Whatever it was dangerous enough that a father would rather abandon his own child than risk her speaking. He stood pacing the cabin. These men, they'll come looking. If they think you're still alive, they won't stop. The girl's voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Then why'd you save me? Thomas froze. It was a fair question. He could have ridden past, pretended he never saw her. That would have been the safer choice. But the truth was, he hadn't had a choice. Something in her eyes had reached into the hollow place inside him, the place left empty when fever took his wife and son years ago. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than him," he said finally. The girl studied him for a long moment, then nodded, as if she'd been testing him and he'd passed. But that night, long after she'd fallen asleep by the fire, Thomas sat awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. He thought he heard hoofbeats in the distance. Faint, then gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the prairie playing tricks. Still, he reached for the rifle leaning by the door and laid it across his knees. Because deep down, he knew the storm was coming. And when it broke, it would bring blood, fire, and the kind of justice only the Wild West could deliver. The morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low on the land and made even the birds fall silent. Thomas Hale was out by the corral, mending a loose rail when he felt it. That old, familiar prickle at the back of his neck. The one that told him he wasn't alone. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. At first there was nothing but the endless sweep of prairie grass. Then he saw it, a thin line of dust rising in the distance, moving steady, deliberate. Riders. He counted 3, maybe 4. Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this, though he'd hoped for more time. Trouble always came quicker than a man wanted. Inside the cabin, the girl was sweeping the floor with a broom far too big for her small hands. She looked up when he stepped in, his face carved with tension. "Get away from the windows," he said. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Her eyes widened. "Is it them?" "Could be," he answered, reaching for the Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall. He checked the chamber, the metallic click echoing in the small room. "Stay quiet. Don't move unless I tell you." The girl obeyed, slipping into the shadows near the hearth. She hugged her knees to her chest, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on him as though he were the only thing standing between her and the darkness outside. Minutes stretched like hours until the riders finally appeared. Four men on horseback, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. They rode with the easy arrogance of men who feared nothing, their dusters flapping, rifles slung across their saddles. The leader, a tall man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, reined in his horse at the fence line. His voice carried across the yard, smooth but edged with menace. "Morning, Hale. Fine day you got here." Thomas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "Don't recall inviting company." The scarred man smiled thinly. "We're just passing through. Heard tell you might have found something that don't belong to you." Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened. "Don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. "See, that's the thing. We got word a little girl went missing. Belongs to her pa. Poor man's been worried sick. Thought maybe she wandered this way, inside the cabin." The girl's breath caught. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to cry out. Thomas didn't flinch. "A man who ties his own blood to a fence post don't deserve to call himself a father. If you're here on his behalf, you best turn around." The scarred man's smile vanished. His hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. "Careful, Hale. You don't want to make enemies you can't handle." Thomas raised the rifle, slow and steady, the barrel glinting in the weak light. "I've handled worse." For a long moment the yard was silent, the only sound the restless shifting of horses. Then the scarred man chuckled, low and dangerous. "We'll be back," he said, turning his horse. "And when we come, we won't be asking polite." The riders wheeled their mounts and disappeared into the prairie, leaving only the churned dust and the echo of their threat. Thomas lowered the rifle, his shoulders heavy. He knew what this meant. They weren't just passing through. They were circling, waiting, planning. Inside, the girl whispered, "They'll kill us, won't they?" Thomas looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and felt the weight of his choice settle on him like a yoke. He could send her away, wash his hands of it all, but he knew he wouldn't. "No," he said firmly, though his voice carried the gravity of a man who'd seen too much death. "Not while I'm breathing." But deep down, he knew the fight had only just begun. The days after the riders' visit were restless ones. Thomas barely slept, his rifle always within reach, his ears tuned to every creak of the cabin walls. The girl, though still quiet, had begun to shadow him more closely, as if she knew the danger was circling and wanted to anchor herself to the only safe thing she had left. On the third night, the storm came. It wasn't thunder that woke Thomas, but the sound of hooves. Fast, hard, too many to be chance travelers. He rose from his cot in an instant, heart pounding, and peered through the window. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, moving toward the ranch like fireflies with malice in their glow. "They're here," he muttered. The girl stirred, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" Thomas's voice was steady, though his blood ran hot. "We fight smart. Stay low. Don't open that door unless I tell you." He grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and slipped out onto the porch. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of dust and sweat. He crouched in the shadows, watching as 6 riders fanned out across his yard. The scarred man dismounted first, his boots crunching on the dirt. He carried himself like a wolf who'd already tasted blood. "Evening, Hale," he called, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "We came to collect what's ours." Thomas stepped into the lantern light, rifle raised. "She ain't yours, and she sure as hell ain't her father's anymore." The scarred man's smile twisted. "You think you can stand against us?" "One man, alone." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "I've been alone a long time. Makes a man dangerous." The standoff broke in an instant. One of the riders swung his rifle up, and Thomas fired first. The crack of the Winchester split the night, and the rider tumbled from his horse, lantern crashing to the ground. Flames licked at the dry grass, throwing wild shadows across the yard. Chaos erupted. Gunfire roared, horses screamed, and the girl inside the cabin pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to run, but she remembered Thomas's words. "Stay low. Don't open that door." Outside, Thomas moved with the grim precision of a man who'd seen war before. He fired, ducked, rolled behind the water trough as bullets splintered the porch rail. Another rider fell, clutching his chest, but there were too many. The scarred man advanced through the smoke, revolver in hand, his eyes locked on Thomas. "You can't save her, Hale. You can't even save yourself." Thomas's rifle clicked empty. He cursed under his breath, drawing the revolver from his hip. The two men circled each other in the firelight, the world around them reduced to smoke, flame, and the pounding of their own hearts. Then, a sound cut through the chaos, a sharp crack, not from Thomas's gun. The scarred man staggered, eyes wide with shock. Behind him, in the cabin doorway, stood the girl. She held Thomas's old pistol in both trembling hands, smoke curling from the barrel. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then the scarred man collapsed into the dirt. The remaining riders, seeing their leader fall, cursed and fled into the night, their horses kicking up sparks as they vanished into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Thomas turned to the girl, his chest heaving. She was shaking, the pistol slipping from her hands as tears streamed down her face. He caught her before she fell, pulling her close. "You did what you had to," he whispered, his voice rough. "You're safe now." But even as he said it, Thomas knew it wasn't true. Killing a man, especially one like that, didn't end trouble. It only drew more. And somewhere out there, in the dark, the girl's father still lived. The ranch smelled of smoke and blood. The fire from the shattered lantern had scorched a patch of dry grass near the corral, leaving blackened earth that still smoldered in the dawn light. Two bodies lay in the dirt, covered with old canvas tarps Thomas had dragged from the barn. The prairie wind tugged at the edges, as if eager to carry the dead away. Thomas stood over them, hat in hand, his face carved with lines of exhaustion. He had buried men before, too many, in fact, but it never got easier. Killing was a weight that settled in the bones, and though he'd done what he had to, he knew the cost would come due. Behind him, the girl sat on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes were red, not from tears alone, but from the smoke and the memory of what she'd done. She hadn't spoken since the shot that felled the scarred man. Thomas walked over, crouching beside her. "You saved my life last night," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I killed him." "You defended yourself," Thomas corrected, his voice firm but gentle. "There's a difference." Her gaze lifted to his, searching, desperate. "Does it ever stop? The way it feels after?" Thomas hesitated. He thought of the war, of the men he'd put in the ground, of the nights he'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by faces he couldn't forget. He wanted to tell her yes, that it would fade, that she'd find peace, but lies had no place between them. "No," he said finally, "it don't stop, but you learn to carry it, and you don't carry it alone anymore. Not while I'm here." For the first time, she leaned against him, small and trembling, but holding on as though he were the last solid thing in a world gone to dust. They stayed like that until the sun climbed higher, painting the land in harsh light. That's when Thomas saw it, tracks in the dirt, leading away from the ranch. The riders who fled had left in a hurry, but not without purpose. They'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't come with 6 men. They'd come with more. He rose, scanning the horizon. "We can't stay here," he said. The girl looked up, startled. "But this is your home." Thomas's jaw tightened. "A home ain't worth much if it gets you killed. Those men won't stop. Not until they've silenced you. And your pa, he's still out there. He'll want to finish what he started." Her face hardened at the mention of her father. "Then we make him stop." Thomas studied her, surprised by the steel in her voice. She was still just a child, but there was something in her, a spark that hadn't been there before. The West had a way of forging people in fire, and she was already changing. He nodded slowly. "We'll ride at first light tomorrow. Head toward Dry Creek. Sheriff, there's an honest man far as I know. If we can get you under his protection, maybe we stand a chance." The girl frowned. "And if the sheriff's bought off too?" Thomas gave a grim smile. "Then we do what folks like us always do. We fight." That night, as the prairie wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, Thomas sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. The girl slept nearby, her face finally peaceful in the glow of the flames. But Thomas's mind was far from rest. He knew the men who had come were just the beginning. He knew the girl's father wasn't just some cruel drunk. He was tied to something larger, something rotten that stretched beyond one ranch, one fence post, one abandoned child. And Thomas Hale, weary cowboy though he was, had just stepped into the middle of it. He looked at the girl, then at the fire, and made a silent oath. Whatever storm was coming, he would see it through. For her, for the family he'd lost, for the man he still hoped he could be. They rode into Dry Creek at first light, dust rising behind them like a trail of ghosts. The sheriff listened to Thomas's account, his weathered face grim as the girl spoke her truth. About her father, the bribes, the men who came to silence her. For once justice found ears willing to hear. Her father was taken in, his secrets dragged into the open. The men who had hunted them scattered, their power broken when the law finally stood tall. When it was over, Thomas and the girl stood outside the jailhouse, the morning sun spilling across the street. She looked up at him, no longer hollow-eyed but steady, alive. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet but sure. "Now we start over, together." And as they walked back toward the waiting horses, the prairie stretched wide before them. Not as a place of loss, but as a land where two broken souls could build something new. A family born not of blood, but of choice.